so much for coming. Hopefully everybody can see. It's our first of our Asset Builder series. We have a few more of these coming up, so hopefully you'll be able to join us here in the office. All of them are going to be here. You guys can come, learn some really cool stuff, and we're going to start this one off with our financial literacy workshop. So we're really excited. We're kind of slow starting today. We wanted to make sure that we gave everybody a chance to come in. Had a bunch of people register, so that was really great.
They can trickle in.
But we can kind of, they can trickle in as they're going. Manitoba Music does much of its work on the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, OG Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the national homeland of the Red River Métis. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past and present, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. I would like to also say that we are saying thank you to our funders. This project was made possible by the financial support of Factor, the Government of Canada, and Canada's private radio broadcasters, and the Manitoba government as well. And I would also like to say thank you to Jessa Johnson for coordinating the MusicWorks series, including the Asset Builder that happened at Swim last month. That's also part of this series, our winter series of programming, MusicWorks. So thank you very much to Jessa. I don't know if anybody was around for Swim. I'm sure a few of you were. Hopefully you had a lot of fun and caught the first part of that. But we are going to continue on with our MusicWorks financial literacy. And to do that, we have brought Kathryn Kerr from Tonic Financial to explain all things money.
All things money, yes.
All of them.
We should have just called it that. All things money.
We might not get to all things money, but we're going to get to a bunch of them. And Kathryn is the right person for the job. So, without further ado.
Thank you.
Go over there.
Thank you. Thanks, Manitoba Music, for having me. I used to come to these all the time, so it's fun to be back standing over all of you and telling you about the things that I learned on the way. I'll intro who I am and what I do first, maybe. So my name's Kathryn Kerr. My pronouns are she, her. And my day job is I run a bookkeeping business called Tonic Financials. Mostly I do bookkeeping and financial consultations for other musicians, but I also do bookkeeping for small businesses and entrepreneurs and some nonprofits and also some like little cafes and hospitality world. I'm just mostly small business, and the world that I know the best is music and musicians because I'm also a musician. So I play in a band called Ken Mode. We're a noise rock band, and I tour a lot with them. And then I also play in a garage rock band called Marin, and I have a solo project. So the reason I got into bookkeeping was just out of a necessity because I was doing a lot of the organizing for the bands that I played in, my earlier projects. And there's not a lot of information that's geared towards musicians specifically. So I had to do a lot of research on my own, and I had a knack for it. So I saw the need, I saw the niche, and I started my business, I guess, almost 4 years ago. Yeah. So that's what I do for a day job. I work while I tour as well, so it's a lot of fun. I'm also a big nerd. I like spreadsheets. I like numbers. You don't have to be super good at math to do this stuff, as we will get into it. But I think everyone is capable of doing their own bookkeeping at the beginning of their music career, and we'll talk about how to do that. And yeah, so that's a little bit about me. Just for format-wise, I kind of think it would be easy to have it an open discussion. So if you do have questions while I'm talking, you can just kind of wave me down and I'll answer the questions as we go. If I'm gonna get to it later, I'll just let you know and we can move along in the presentation. But yeah, there's a small group of us, so we can kind of have it open. I'm not a CPA, so I'm not an accountant, and I'm not a tax professional. So just disclaimer, because being a tax professional is a whole other ballgame, but I do work really closely with accountants, and I do tax prep for all my clients. So we're gonna delve into taxes a little bit, because I think that's a lot of the time what musicians have the most questions about, because it's one of the biggest entities you deal with, the income tax system. So the three things that we're mainly going to talk about today what it means to be self-employed, and also what the different business structures are if you're a musician. We'll talk about sales tax versus income tax, because they're two separate tax systems that you deal with as a musician, and then bookkeeping best practices. Usually I like to talk about that point first, but we're kind of going in reverse order because mostly people have tax questions at this time of year. So yeah. So first thing we're going to talk about is what it means to be employed versus self-employed. So we'll quickly do a rundown. This is a summary from the CRA. Canada Revenue Agency is where I get obviously a lot of my information from. This is sort of a summarized version of what they define as what it means to be employed by someone, have an employer, and what it means to be self-employed. So we'll kind of, I have 4 points for it. If you can't read this, I'll read it out while we go anyways. So if you're employed, if you have an employer, tax is going to be deducted from your paychecks. So income tax is coming off on every paycheck. When you're self-employed, your income tax is payable at the end of the year, and it's either paid quarterly or it could be paid quarterly in installments if your income is high enough, or it's paid in one lump sum. So that's at the end of the year, your income tax. If you're employed, all your income from your job is reported to the CRA. So that is, you get T4 slips. Now a lot of your T4 slips go right to your online profile. You used to always get a piece of paper, sometimes it's online now. For self-employed people, some of your income might be on tax slips, but a lot of it will not. So an example of that right away is there's some grant agencies that issue T4As. Factor issues T4As. I believe Canada Council also issues T4As. Those are mostly the places that you see income being reported on like an official tax slip as a musician. But most of your income, whether you receive, most of your income will not be reported to the CRA. So if you play a gig at the Handsome Daughter, you're not getting a T4A from them. You know, if you collect royalties, you're not getting a T4A from that entity. So it's your responsibility, whether you get a tax slip or not, all of your income still has to be reported. And that is at the year end on your income tax. We'll talk about income tax next. So that's the difference on point 2. Third difference, when you're employed, your employer is going to pay half of your CPP premiums. CPP stands for Canadian Pension Plan. They also will pay your EI, and if you qualify, you might have workers' comp or benefits. So all those things are coming off on your pay stub, right? Your income tax is coming off, your CPP, EI, if you have benefits, and then you're netting whatever you take home, right? If you're self-employed, you're going to pay CPP premiums as determined on your income tax filing. It's not up to us to figure that out. It's a complicated system. Like I said, I'm not an income tax professional. That will be something that your tax preparer will figure out for you. But just know that you may be paying into CPP from your income, and it's not, obviously it's not coming off every paycheck like if you were employed. If you're self-employed, no EI premiums are paid on your behalf. So most musicians do not buy into the employment insurance program. You can opt in. I don't think I know any musicians who do. There might be some benefits. Well, one example of when people wonder, should I pay into the EI program, would be parental leave. So let's say you're a full-time working musician and you're planning on having a family. You're like, well, what do? I'm not going to get maternity benefits or paternity benefits because that is part of the EI program in Canada. So people think, oh, well, should I start opting in to pay into the EI program so that I can get money from the government while I'm on leave? The problem with that is once you start paying into the program, you can't stop. So I've had people that are like, oh, well, I'll pay into it now, collect some, and then I'll stop. And that's fine, I can get some when I'm on mat leave. They won't let you stop paying into it. So most people I know will just do their own version of saving money so that they can take a leave if they want to. And that's why it's so important to talk about budgeting and bookkeeping and know where your money's going and how much you need to save. Because we don't, as self-employed musicians, we're not putting aside CPP money in the same way automatically, and we're not paying into EI the same way as when you're employed. So yeah, quick little note on EI. If you have questions about EI, we can talk about it after, but I don't know any musicians that, personally that pay into the EI program. And then the last point, if you're employed, you're hardly doing any bookkeeping. You know, you might have to keep some receipts for allowable expenses. So let's say you have a travel allowance from your employer and you keep your receipts for food or your Uber if you have a transportation allowance. And then all you're keeping with your bookkeeping would be things that you need at your year-end income tax for your personal income tax filing. So maybe you have education or tuition amounts that your tax preparer is asking for. If you paid charitable donations, your medical receipts, those are like your personal bookkeeping things that you need for year-end taxes. When you're self-employed, you're responsible for keeping everything all the time. So you have to keep all records and receipts, and the CRA may ask to see all of those documents at any time, and that's called getting audited. We've probably all heard that before. So who is employed in this room? Who has an employer? Who is self-employed? You should all have your hands up if you're self-employed. Because if you're playing music or if you're in the music industry, I would say that we are all self-employed in this room. Yeah. If you don't know what, if you have questions about, like, if you don't, a lot of gig workers are like, oh, well, I work contract work for this one entity, and they give me a T4A slip. Does that mean I'm an employee or an employer, or am employed or self-employed? The CRA does have a really long list of criteria that they look for if it's a gray area. If you have questions about your specific situation, you can talk to me after, but for the most part, it should be quite obvious. If you're getting a pay stub, you're employed, and I would say all of us in this room are, on paper, we can say that we're self-employed. So the main question that I get after I'm like, okay, you're all self-employed, what does that mean? People usually ask, well, if I'm self-employed, does this apply to me even if I don't have a business number? And the answer is yes. You can be self-employed and not be registered with a business number. You can still file your income tax as a self-employed business without a business number. We'll talk about business numbers next. The times that you need a business number are when you register for GST and when you register for a payroll account, if that happens. So there's certain moments in time that you will need one from the government. And I also, as musicians, would say there's another big moment in time where you need a business number, and it has to do with MFM, actually. So this is what happens a lot of the time. MFM, you can get grants from Manitoba Film and Music, and they need you to have a business bank account in order to deposit funds. That's part of their criteria for their grant program. In order to open the business bank account, you need a business number. So what happens a lot of the time is some musicians will not have those steps in place, and they'll get the grant first, right? Then all of a sudden you're scrambling, you have potentially a tour that you're planning, you now have grant reporting requirements, you don't have a business bank account, so you have to open one, and you also don't have a business number. So I recommend that even if you're not hitting the GST time or payroll time or whatever, one of the first steps is just get your business number. Do it early, do it before you need it. It's not that much paperwork. It's not that expensive. I think it's $50 to renew. Is it every year, every 3 years?
60.
It's 60? Oh, $60. And I can't remember if it's every year. I mean, they just email me, I do it, whatever.
15 minutes online?
Yeah.
Like very quick.
And so the place that you get a business number is called the Company's Office, Manitoba. And they're really helpful. If you don't know where to go online or if it's confusing, you just call them. And they have real people that are there, and they will answer your questions too. So yes, so I would say all of us are self-employed individuals, and you can start thinking of yourself as a business even before you've made any money. That was some of the advice that I was given early on in my music career. Just start thinking of yourself as an artistic business now, and start getting the steps in place early, because then you're not scrambling when you have that, oh, I'm supposed to already have a business number. Now I have 15 things to do, as opposed to just doing it now. So let's talk maybe a little bit about What do I have on the next one? I believe, business entity structure. So you're going to go to Companies Office Manitoba. Yeah.
Sorry, before you.
No.
continue,
I like
just
questions.
have a question. You were just talking about the business number and
Yeah.
how you have to renew. Do you get email notifications for that? Because
I'm trying to remember.
I just registered my business last year in January, so
Mm-hmm.
I've been waiting for something. So I guess it would be best interest for me to call
Manitoba Companies Office?
to confirm.
I think you can call them, but I seem to remember that I would get an email and potentially a letter. But if they have, one thing that you can do is actually go and look at your profile on their online portal.
Yeah.
And it'll see, like, there's a spot that you can put in your email address. I think it is on. Does anyone else remember? Did they email you?
I didn't get an email, but they sent me a letter.
Send you a letter. Yeah, I think it comes in the mail.
I didn't get an email. I just was applying for a grant, and I was like, oh, I got to do this.
Yeah,
And I was like, is it even still there? And so I went there, and it wasn't.
and it wasn't. So it expires.
It expired, and I didn't get it.
It might have been just they didn't have your current address as well. That could happen. But when in doubt, you can always log into the online portal and see. I'm bad at, I guess I just have they somehow contact me and I somehow renew. That's how my brain works. So how many people already have a business number? Okay, awesome. Love it. So we'll talk, for those of you that do already, you'll probably know some of this, but it might help. This might be good information if you're ever thinking, well, should I be incorporated potentially? We're going to talk about the 3 different business entity structures that musicians usually choose. I'm not going to go over nonprofits and registered charities because that's another topic. So we'll talk about these 3 first. So sole proprietorship. This is taken directly off of the Canada Revenue Agency website. So I just copied and pasted it, and I'll read it out and summarize. So a sole proprietorship is unincorporated. It's an unincorporated business that's owned by one individual. It's the simplest kind of business structure. I mostly recommend musicians to be sole proprietorships for as long as possible. The owner of the sole prop has sole responsibility for decision making. You receive all the profits, claim all the losses. It does not have separate legal status. So if you're a sole prop, you also assume all the risks of the business, and the risk can extend even to your personal property and assets. I think a lot of people get caught up on that point and they think, oh my goodness, that means that all my house, they can get my car or my house, or I would say, how often are musicians in Canada getting sued? Not very often. This point scares a lot of people, and I have not seen it be a problem for most people. Do not incorporate just because you're worried about the risk factor, because you also have to think, well, how much money are you actually bringing in as a sole proprietor? If you're bringing in significant amounts of money, let's say like $100,000, maybe you're considering incorporation. Maybe you're already talking to tax professionals and lawyers at that point. I think things will happen in your career that you will already be talking to people if you're making that amount of significant money, and they'll be able to advise you better. So I think thinking you need to become an incorporation early just because of the personal risk is not a good reason to incorporate, essentially. So if you're a sole proprietorship, you pay personal income tax on the net income generated by your business. That means your employment income, if you have employment income, and your self-employment income all gets counted on the same income tax filing form, and you pay tax on the total of both. So we'll talk about the income tax system a little bit in more detail next. And you may choose to register a business name or operate under your own name, or you can do both, or you can just take out a number. You don't have to pay for a number. You can just get a business number. That can be the name, and you can go from there. So I, for example, am a sole proprietorship still. I have 2 operating names. One is Tonic Financials, and the other one is Kathryn Kerr Music. I track both of them separately, so I track my financial stuff, my business with its own bookkeeping system. I track all my music work with my own bookkeeping system because I find that easiest. And all of it, though, technically is under one sole proprietorship. The next one is a partnership. So a partnership's an association or relation between two or more individuals, corporations, trusts, or partnerships that join together to carry on trade or business. Normally for musicians, it's two individuals. I don't know anyone that's a trust partnership. Each partner contributes money, labor, property, or skills to the partnership. In other words, they both work for the business. They're both doing work for the business. In return, each partner is entitled to a share of the profits or the losses, and the business profits or losses are usually divided among the partners based on an agreement. So if there's two partners, usually it's 50-50. If there's 4 members, it might be 25, split evenly. But you can have partnership agreements that are whatever you want, 80-20. You just have to have it written out, and you have to keep it consistent every year when you file your income tax. And if you want to make changes, you have to let the CRA know. Partnerships, I would say, are best for groups that think they're going to be together for a very long time, because partnerships have a little bit more coordination involved than sole props. So let's say you just create a band, there's 4 of you. You're like, oh, well, we're a group, we're gonna be working together. Should we become a partnership? I would ask, how long are you actually gonna be the 4 of you in this band? 10 years? You know, are you gonna leave and do other things? Is someone in the band also teaching music lessons on the side? Are you going to do studio work for another band? How are you going to track that outside of the partnership? Most of the time, my advice is everyone to operate as a sole proprietor within the group. You can still obviously do things collectively, but for tax-wise and bookkeeping-wise, it's a lot easier to just each individually take out your business number. And we'll look at a couple examples of how you can do bookkeeping as a band, but still be sole props. So is anyone in a partnership? Yeah? How long has your partnership been running?
10 years.
10 years. See, there we go. Maybe good example of it's good to have a partnership.
I will likely never part ways.
So that's good. Like, the other partnerships that I know of are like theater collectives. It's like they're a theater group. They've been running it. That's their only entity that they're doing. They're not doing outside work. But I also know bands that started partnerships, and they were a band for 2 years, and then they all broke off and did other projects. So what happens to that partnership now? Or what happens to the money that they were making from other bands? It's just more admin work. And as musicians, we want to spend the least amount of time doing this as we possibly can. So, yeah.
So about the partnership.
Yeah.
With sole proprietorship, you don't necessarily need a business number, but if it's a partnership, you do.
You don't need not to file your income tax. You could actually just file without a business number as well. But most people you have to have a partnership agreement though, and that usually gets written up when you get a business number. I don't think I've ever seen anyone have a partnership and file their income tax without a business number. So I think it kind of just goes hand in hand because you have to have that partnership agreement made up. So, yeah. Yeah, so then the last one is a corporation. So a corporation is a separate legal entity. So it's a person, really. It can enter into contracts and own its own property, and it can own property in its own name, and it's separate and distinct from its owners. And since the corp has a separate legal entity, it has to pay tax on its income, and it files its own tax return. So if you have a corporation, if a corporation exists, it has its own tax return outside of your personal income tax return. The other 2 structures that we just talked about, sole proprietorship and partnerships, that actually all gets filed on your personal income tax. There's just extra forms at the end of it. Corporations have corporate income tax filing. It's different. They are more complicated to file. They have potentially different fiscal years. When people talk about fiscal years, it just means what 12-month period are you counting as a year. That's why a lot of businesses, their fiscal ends in March. So instead of January to December as their year, they have like a March, April fiscal year. So they file their taxes at different times. But I have some clients that their corporation and their busiest time of the year is December, January, so they don't want to be dealing with tax filing at that time. So they move their fiscal year so that they file their taxes in the summer when they're less busy. Things like that. So to set up a corporation, you have to fill out an article of incorporation, and then you file it with the appropriate provincial, territorial, or federal authorities. I would say that no one should be setting up a corporation without the consultation of a lawyer or an accountant, and hopefully both. The reason, some of the things that mostly I hear about people asking questions, well, what are the benefits of being a corp? Or I've heard that there's benefits of being incorporated. The main one is tax savings. People think, oh, I can save money if I'm incorporated. So it is true that corporations are taxed at a lower rate than than personal taxes. So let's say you make, let's say you're making $40,000, there's a tax rate, you have to pay taxes on that $40,000. The tax rate, I don't know what they are this year, so I can't even pull that up, but you have one tax rate for personal income tax. A corporation that makes $40,000 actually has a lower tax rate, so they'll pay less taxes on the same amount of money. So there is a tax saving benefit. The problem is corporations have a big startup cost. It costs money to fill out like the articles that you need, and you also have to hire a lawyer, or you should be hiring a lawyer. They cost money to maintain every year. It's more expensive than just renewing your business number. And you really should be hiring a tax professional every year to file your corporate income tax. So the money saving in the end doesn't always work out. If you have questions about incorporation, or if you don't know if you should incorporate, my advice always is just talk to an accountant. I'm going to repeat that probably a lot in here, but that's sort of like my mantra. We are musicians. We are not tax professionals. We are not CPAs. That is not your job. There will be times where hiring outside help is beneficial for your career. So corporation would definitely be one of those times if you're incorporating. Okay, so we talked about the difference between employment income and self-employment income. And then these other two terms are something that I like to go over, especially during tax time, because I think it's confusing for a lot of musicians. The idea of your accounting income versus your taxable income. These are such bookkeeper words, I'm so sorry, but it'll make sense in a second. So when we talk about accounting income, what I'm talking about is like your bookkeeping data. What is the money that you made? We'll go through the flow chart actually. So now we're talking about as self-employed individuals, okay? So as musicians, there's income that we make, so that's our gross income. So all of the income you've made from your grants, your gig money, your merch sales, you're tracking your gross income. Then you have all your expenses as a musician. So that could be things like music equipment, your production costs, when you're buying merch items, and then you're left with net income. So that is your bookkeeping data. That is your accounting net income, okay? Now let's talk about what your taxable net income means. Because when it comes to tax season, when it comes to tax time, you will be left with a different number at the end. So when you submit all of your information at income tax time, you're going to report your gross income, so all the money that you made as a musician, minus, and this is the key difference, eligible expenses. Because the CRA has a different definition of what you can write off as a business expense on your income tax than what you can count as a business expense just for your own bookkeeping purposes. So you're minusing eligible expenses, minus any more deductions that the CRA allows for income tax time, and then you're coming up with your taxable net income. So this is your final income amount for tax purposes only. The reason that I differentiate this, so I think a lot of musicians will only do their bookkeeping at the end of the tax year, but I think that it's not giving you the whole picture of where you're at in your financial situation, and therefore you can't make as good of decisions that you would be able to otherwise. So the first step is very important. And I talk about like year-round tax prep. That's what we want to be doing. We want to make sure that we know what our actual net income is, and we're not just doing our bookkeeping just for tax purposes. So we have two different, there could be, another good example for this one would be your tax preparer might ask you for information about your house or your apartment, because you can write off a portion of your house as a business expense, because all of us are operating from home on our laptops, you know. And so that can actually be an eligible expense and a deduction on your income tax. But I would not include that in my accounting data, because that's just my living expenses, right? So these two totals are going to be different, and it's important to be able to find both of them, I would say. Our job is the first one. We want to know what we're making, what our full expenses are. The tax professionals will be doing the second one. So after we know our taxable net income, what your tax professional is doing is they're taking that amount, they're timesing it by whatever tax rate is applicable to you, and the tax rates are based on how much money you make. Then they're adding or subtracting credits that you might have, and at the end you are left with either you owe income tax to the government or the government owes you money back, a tax rebate. Because sole proprietorships and partnerships, they all go on your personal income tax. Let's say you make negative in 1 year as you're self-employed, you're a musician. Let's say it was a really, really intense year. You did a lot of, you invested really heavily into making an album. So you netted negative $2,000. That $2,000 actually goes against whatever money you made for your employment income. So it's in your best interest at the beginning, even if you're making no money as a musician, you really should be filing as self-employed, because you could get money back from the government. That is what happened to me when I was first a musician. So there is a benefit from filing, even if you're like, well, I'm hardly operating, you know, you're always spending money on your music business, I find. So does that make sense? Does anyone have questions about that? That was a lot of words, but both systems are very important. Good? Yeah. You're good?
Oh, I earlier on you were saying you have your music business.
Yeah.
And then you have your that business.
Yeah.
Those are separate. How do you separate those?
Honestly,
Books?
I separate them by tracking them.
Separate business numbers?
They don't actually. So they have separate operating names, but I don't have separate business numbers for them. They have two different GST accounts, because I'm registered for GST. So I do have different GST accounts for them, which was kind of complicated, and even the GST office was not very helpful with that. But they don't actually have separate business numbers. I had a very hard time getting answers about that when I was registering, so it was pretty funny.
So it's not. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
If I was doing music stuff, but I also have, like right now, I'm getting money for a support home, which is social services.
Yeah.
And I'm going to be doing my taxes. And, but I'm just thinking, do I have to get like a different number for that?
You wouldn't need to get a different number per se, but I would recommend filling out, like I would give the information to whoever files your taxes separately, so that they would fill it out on two different, it's like the statement of business activities, exactly, one of those. So that's how I do mine. At the end, honestly, it nets all on one line at the end. But yeah, I don't actually think you need a separate business number for them. Yep. I use my operating names for both of them. So I did register two different names. So yeah. Okay, so we'll delve into our two tax systems a little bit more, because we've been talking a lot about income tax, but there's also sales tax. And the two sales tax that we're going to talk about are GST or HST. That's the federal sales tax, or RST or PST, retail sales tax or provincial sales tax. There are other tax systems. Obviously, there's international tax. There's also other provincial taxes, but we're not going to talk about those ones today. because these are the ones that we normally deal with. So, okay, we'll talk a little bit more about income tax right now, because that's what's coming up. That's what mostly people have questions about. So I have a copy in your handout of what the income tax form looks like. So I don't know if anyone's actually filled out the forms in person ever. No one does these by hand anymore. My mother still does them. Have you? Yeah? My mom worked in finance, so hence why I'm doing what I do probably. But she still does all her forms by hand. You can get these from the CRA. If you use a tax software like TurboTax or something like that, they're still doing this, but they're just doing it in the back end. So all the stuff you're filling out is just the software is then populating it onto one of these sheets. So if you do ever use tax software and file by yourself, make sure you find where to download these actual forms, because they don't always get it right. I had to help someone this year where they put in a grant on the wrong line. They just misread the prompts on TurboTax, and the grant ended up on 2 lines on here. And we were only able to discover that by looking through the actual forms. So this is the addition to your income tax, your personal income tax filing. So this is kind of just tacked on after your tax preparer does your personal income tax one. Most of the information you don't need to know about, but there's 2 sections that we're just going to look at quickly. The first one is Part 4. Part 4 is where you're putting your expenses. This is where most people have the most questions about, because you're like, what can I write off? You know, what does it mean to have like a business write-off? Write off your expenses. This is the list that Canada Revenue Agency gives all self-employed individuals. So it's not specific to industry. So they're very, very broad. Essentially, we fit, as musicians, all of our expenses are going to fit into these categories somehow. Even if you have different wording for it, your tax preparer still has to put it somewhere on these lines. So this is actually what I base all of my expense categories as a musician. This is what I've based it off of. So I'm trying to think if there's any that we should, maybe I'll just quickly go through them. The next slide too is going to be the list of, like, I've kind of broken down what I consider the list for musician expenses on the left-hand side there. But maybe I'll go through what the CRA says, and we can kind of like see if we can guess what musician expenses go in each one. So obviously advertising is just pretty straightforward. Any advertising and marketing expenses that you have. Meals and entertainment are business meals. It has to be business activity. It can't just be you going out for lunch. Although, if me and you went out for lunch, Ashley, and we talked not about music at all, I would still write it off as a business expense. Of course I would. Yeah.
About that, so if I go somewhere to have a meeting with someone, that's good. What if I'm a contract worker and I'm doing some hours in space, if I bring in lunch, could I still count that?
I would. I mean, the thing is, with this, like, you're always just trying to make sure that if you get audited, if the CRA comes knocking at your door, asking questions, you just need to have sort of the proof and the backstory of why is there a number on that line? Why do you have that? Where did you get that number from? Why is that amount there? So, like, if I'm grabbing lunch in between after a meeting or something and I'm not actually meeting with someone, I still write it off as a business expense. So, yeah.
I have been audited.
Yes, oh.
So if you want to know about being audited, feel free to ask.
I have to talk to you after about the experience too, so. It's not fun, right? How many years, how many years back did they make you get documentation?
4 years.
Okay, yeah. They can audit you up to like 7 years of information, yeah. Now.
I've actually been audited 3 times.
No.
And I've had to pay back, and yeah, they're pretty good with it. Like, they'll say, this is the reason why, and then send the paperwork as to why, but it is unexpected.
Yeah.
Big question.
You can at least, now you can keep files electronically. You used to have fizical copies. They will accept electronic copies now, which is really nice. So I would say keep all of your receipts electronically. We'll talk about, like I said, we're gonna talk about bookkeeping best practices at the end. So we'll talk more about keeping your receipts. But okay, let's keep going through the categories. Bad debts, I wouldn't worry too much about that. That means you were expecting money, you kind of already claimed that you were getting this money and then the money fell through. Let's say you booked a huge festival, they were gonna give you a $10,000 guarantee, and you said, yeah, you already invoiced for it, you counted that income, and then they backed out and you lost it, you could write that off as bad debt. You don't have to worry about this. The main thing is just keep really good records, because then your tax professional could maybe put something on that line. Insurance, this is not your house insurance. This is your insurance for your instruments or your travel insurance. House stuff is a different, separate section. Interest and bank charges, that's for your business bank accounts, not your personal bank accounts. Business taxes, licenses and memberships, your membership to Manitoba Music, your visas, your union dues. And personally, I also put subscription memberships on this line, like Spotify, Amazon Prime, stuff like that. I will point this out. Total expenses, the categories honestly don't matter that much, because all of these numbers are getting summed and put down here. If you're like, where do I put this? I don't know what category it is in. This is so stressful. Don't worry too much about it. In the end, your tax professional is going to pick what categories, where things go. Your job is to keep the records, have really good notes, and if you get audited, be able to explain it. So I would say again, our job is to not become CPAs and tax preparers. Our job is to keep records. So yeah, you can put a lot of things on this line. Office expenses, I usually just have things like actual office expenses, paper, pens, notebooks. Office stationery and supplies. This is actually where I count music supplies. So things like strings, reeds, picks. What else are people buying? I'm a saxophone player and a guitar player, so I'm just thinking of my things that I do. Pardon me? Yeah, oh yeah. Oh yes.
Keyboard stand?
Yeah. Yeah, keyboard stands, absolutely, everything, all of that.
Music interfaces as well?
Yes. Oh, wow. So some of that, depending on the amount, might become an asset. That's gonna go on these bottom lines, capital cost allowance. So bigger purchase items, they're going to be counted a little bit differently on your income tax return than other smaller items. The CRA, again, that's why it's really important to know that there is a difference between accounting information and tax information, because on your income taxes, larger items, they get counted over many years on your income tax. It's called depreciation. Your job, again, is to not figure out your depreciation schedules. That's your tax preparer's job. You keep good records. If you bought an interface, you just need to know, okay, well, what did I buy? How much was it? Your tax professional can then determine what line that goes on. My rule usually is if it's over $1,000, then I write it off as an asset, give or take. But that's, yeah.
Just a quick question. So I purchased an interface just a couple months before I registered for my business number. And so I guess it's 2025 now, so obviously that wouldn't count, would it?
You can do it, yeah. You can also you can, like let's say you made business purchases before the income tax year, you can count them on the current. If they have not been recognized yet, you can still. So I would keep your receipts, have that amount, put that down somewhere, and you can write it off on this year's taxes, absolutely. I'd have to look at the documentation. Again, I would say like keep all your stuff, have it written down, have the dates in there, and then talk to someone that prepares taxes and see what they say. Yeah, you're like, ooh, I could find a lot of stuff. I mean, think of.
I'm just starting to do my business
Yeah.
stuff now, so 3 years ago I bought a laptop, but I'm using it for music stuff.
Probably what your tax preparer will do is like think of the fair market value of your laptop now and count that. So it'd be like, okay, your MacBook was $3,000 back then, but now, you know what I mean? Like, yeah. So, but again, like keep that information somewhere, have it handy and say like, hey, I use this for my business. What can we do with this information? Yeah, I would, if you were one of my clients, I would absolutely count that as one of your assets for your business and put it on your taxes and also put it in your bookkeeping info. So, and the reason why we want to write off this stuff, just again, is all these expenses, whatever you end up with on this line, that goes against your income that you made and you pay less taxes. So the more expenses you can find, the better. I write off so much stuff because obviously my life is like my 2 businesses. So pretty much everything that I do can somehow be related back to either music or my bookkeeping stuff. So yeah, I try to write off a lot. And it's not a lie, it's just, it's my life. So professional fees, that'll be legal fees, accounting fees, but you could also on this line, see these 2 lines are really similar. Again, because this is for every single industry. This is not industry specific. They have to make this for anyone that's self-employed. So there's professional fees or management and admin fees. Things like your booking agent, your engineer. What line does it go on? Maybe management and admin fees, maybe professional fees. Again, your job is just to keep the information, keep the records. Mm-hmm.
So the booking agent percentage, is that what you're talking about?
Yeah.
So she gives me this year, she gave me a year and whatever.
Balance. Yes, her entire amount, yeah. That's a business expense, absolutely. But then that also means you have to claim the full amount of income. So a lot of booking agencies will collect on your behalf and then take their fee out of it and then net you that money. If you're gonna be claiming the fee that you paid, you also then have to recognize the full amount of income that you made, right? You can't just claim the expense without, you know what I mean? So a lot of people get caught, they're like, oh, well, I paid 15% to my booking agent, but they're only declaring the income of what hit their bank. You can't do both. You can't double dip, essentially. If you're gonna claim the expense, then you also have to claim the full amount of income that you made. So, like that's how Pecan does it. If you're on Pecan's roster, they will just send you net amounts and you'll just be like, oh yeah, I got a deposit from Pecan. But if you ask for their statements, you'll see you actually made $5K, then they took their fee and then they deposited 4,000, whatever it is, right? To do proper bookkeeping, you really should be recognizing the full amount of income minus the expense on your bookkeeping.
So like the contract.
Yeah. It's good to get all your slips. Look at your stuff. Look at your stuff, people. Look at your emails. The next one is rent. This is not your house or apartment rent. This is rent on rehearsal spaces or other buildings. Because again, your house is in a different section. Repairs and maintenance, that would be your guitar repairs. If you have to get setups for your instruments. You could even say like, I don't know, let's say you have to get repairs. Well, yeah, mostly it's like instrument repairs on this line that I'm thinking of. Salaries, wages, and benefits, ignore that one. That's usually not applicable.
Sorry, so professional fees, is that, so I'm getting a certain amount of money for like a big festival or whatever, I'm paying out my band.
Yes, oh yeah, that's a huge one. I didn't even say that. Yeah, musician fees.
That's gonna be the one that's.
Yes.
I didn't pay
Absolutely.
all that, because I paid all that.
Absolutely, that's a write-off. So all your musician fees, any studio session players you hire, all of that, I would put that on the professional fees line. Yeah, absolutely. Hey, yeah.
Just back to the one. Do like instrument rentals count under that as well?
Yeah, I would probably put that under that line. Whatever makes sense. Again, like it's going to net at the bottom here, right? So just, we'll look at my sort of categories afterwards, but they all have to fit somewhere in here, But I would put instrument rentals and equipment rentals on this line as well.
Transfer records.
We'll talk about record keeping last. Yeah, we'll do that next. Travel expenses, this is all your tour expenses. If you fly for a conference, I would also say, let's say you're going to, what's in Toronto? I don't know. If you're going to Toronto for something music related, everything's in Toronto, right? Yeah.
Supposed to be on May.
Yeah, there we go. You could probably justify most of that trip as a business write-off. But again, if you get audited and they come asking questions like, well, how long was the conference? Why were you here for X amount more days? What were you doing the whole time? You just want to make sure that it's believable and it's reasonable, I would say. If you're making $0, but you're expensing 2 trips that cost, $6,000 each and you just went to one day at a conference and you're trying to write that off as a business expense, the CRA is probably not going to be happy. So it just has to stay reasonable, right?
For under travel expenses, food as well.
Yeah, you know what? You could put I put travel meals often just go on the meals and entertainment line because again, CRA only allows you to have 50% of that as eligible. But per diems, if you pay someone a per diem, that is actually an eligible expense at 100% for the CRA. I don't know why. I don't make the rules. So a lot of bands will actually pay out per diems to their band members and write that off. That gets complicated too though if everyone's a sole prop, but just know that, yeah, per diems are 100% write-off and meals and entertainment is only 50. Our job is to keep the record, because in your bookkeeping sense of things, whatever you pay for meal, that's a fully 100% expense, right? So your job is just to keep the record, make a really good note, where were you traveling, what day was it, what did you buy, what was it for, and your tax preparer will help you figure out where is that going.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I just meant let's say I get groceries.
Yeah.
Going to a meal assembly.
Oh yeah, no, that's.
Under meals?
Yeah, under meals. Okay. Yeah, if you buy groceries for the band and stick it in the band van, that is absolutely like an expense, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So could I pay myself a per diem?
It gets complicated for, you're a sole prop, you're not an employee. So what I would normally do is you also have to have proof of your receipts anyways. And so it usually ends up being easier and more worth your while to just save all your food receipts and total them up. Tax preparers can do this thing where they, instead of figuring out the exact amount of meals that you spent, they can do an average. So some tax preparers will just ask you, well, how many travel days did you have? How many days were you on tour for? And they just do a base rate. If the base rate number is higher than what you actually spent, they can put that on your tax forms. Again, though, our job is just to keep the records and let someone else figure it out, I would say. So keep your receipts for your meals, yeah.
So if I buy a ticket for someone's show here, because I want to bring them onto one of my future shows, that would be under one of these categories?
Yeah, I would put it, you could kind of put it under a bunch of things. Some like concert tickets and stuff, I usually put under meals and entertainment. But if you're networking and you are handing out, I don't know, if you're trying to get someone to play on your record, I could also justify it's an advertising expense. Okay. Yeah, and then you can write it off 100%. So I write off, I also have been known in the past to just okay, well, I'm buying tickets to Folk Fest and a couple of my clients are playing it, and I write it off as general office expenses because I want to expense the whole amount. So I just have to keep notes, know that if I get audited, they could ask for money back, but yeah.
Okay, so just an example of that, because back in the summer, I went for a one night trip to Calgary, and I was networking with some people that I met online, and I gave them my stickers, and we kind of talked a little bit of business. So technically, I could still claim that. Yeah.
You were doing what it was for your current business now?
My current business now.
Yes.
My first music, so we were just talking music and
stuff. And often too, I've done this a lot where I've taken a business trip, but it's also been I also was there for a little bit longer doing personal. You can also determine well, reasonably speaking, how much was personal, how much was business? Was it 50-50? Take 50% of your flight, 50% of the hotel, and put that as that was business, the rest was personal. That looks really good. If you can keep that kind of record and then show that to the CRA, they will love that. So same goes for your utilities. On this line, I do phone and internet. Same with your phone. We all have cell phones. We're all doing business on our phones all the time, but we're doing personal stuff on our phones too. So you can make sure you have that information available to you, and then with your tax preparer, determine, well, how much is reasonable? So for example, when I was just a musician and I didn't have a bookkeeping business, I said 50% of my phone is self-employed, use, 50% is personal use. So I knew how much I was paying for my phone for the whole year, and half of it was a business expense. Now I have 2 businesses, so I say, the whole thing is a business expense. You know, I feel like that's reasonable, right? So my internet and my phone, 100% business expense for me. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was going to ask a similar example.
Yeah.
It's kind of verging on theoretical, but if you own 2 businesses and like my dad wants me to take over his engineering firm. So
Big business, okay.
so if I am meeting with an engineer who also happens to be a musician, and I write that off as both, like for both 50% of the meals expense.
If you want, it might be easier to just say, we talked mostly about music. You know, it might just be easier at the end of the day to say it was one or the other. And also, we'll talk about the way that I like to use business bank accounts to keep track of your stuff at the end. It might just be easier to put it on one card. And that's the expense for that. So, yeah. But you can split it up. Honestly, because I have 2 businesses, I don't usually split them. I just decide, okay, is this going to be music or is this going to be Tonic Financials? Yeah. And then the last couple, fuel costs, that's not your car. That's like if you're a potter and you're buying, or you're like getting fuel like for your kiln or something like that. We don't really have fuel costs. Mm-hmm.
Do you like the mileage tracker?
Yes, so that comes into a different line though, and it's motor vehicle expenses. So the last 2 points, motor vehicle expenses and capital cost allowance, I am not going to go over because they're too confusing. And they're a longer process and people have too many questions about them, which I get. But just know that if you use your car for your business, you can write off a portion of it. And capital cost allowance is what we were talking about, bigger asset items. Your tax professional will want to know what were the big purchase items, and they're going to treat it differently than these other items on here. Again, your job is to keep good records. So if you have a vehicle that you're using for your business, I would just say that you should be able to estimate at the end of the year, what percentage did you use that for music? What percentage did you use that for personal? I know a lot of people that get away with not using mileage logs because they're a huge pain in the ass. So you're supposed to, you're absolutely supposed to. It's much more accurate to like, okay, I'm getting in my car, writing down how many miles, and then at the end you give your tax professional that information and they do a percentage calculation. What I've done is just, okay, this is the stats on my car, you know, this is how much it's worth, this is whatever, I have information about my car. These were some of the major repairs I did to my car. Then your tax professional will be like, okay, you used it 15% for your business. They just apply that percentage to whatever your expenses were. I also would say that unless you're using a car specifically to tour, it's almost not worth tracking your personal car stuff because it's a huge administrative burden. It just takes so long. So unless you have a vehicle that you're using to go on tour a lot, I almost wouldn't worry about it. Because your time is also sort of precious and money in a way, because if you can be, maybe you should be just spending time on your arts practice and not spending time on your mileage log. Like, you know what I mean? So, yeah, don't get caught doing too much tracking for your car. Yeah.
For digital receipt tracking, like, is a PNG like a screenshot enough?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. As long as it's like legible, right. You know? Okay. So the next page, this is just an example of like what I give some of my clients for examples of what we're writing off. You can read this at home. All of these things will fit into, hopefully, these tax categories, right? But this is just a list of all the things. On the left-hand side, this is expenses. We already kind of talked about this, but I just have an asterisk beside food because usually the question is, was the meal just you grabbing lunch or was it official business? Because the CRA defines eligible expenses as costs you incur to earn business income. So your meals have to be business related. All I recommend doing is just making a little note on the receipt itself. On the right-hand side, I've listed some common income categories because we haven't really talked about income. So if you look at, what section is it? Hold on. On the income tax form, if you look at part 3A, yeah, here we go. 3A, all it says is gross sales, commissions, or fees. You don't see a big list of income categories like they had on the expenses. The CRA actually just lumps it all onto one line. They don't really differentiate different types of income. So it's up to you how you want to track your income. So these are some common income categories that I see that musicians want to know the difference between. You might have different buckets that you want to track, right? But generally speaking, you would like to know, this is good information for making decisions. How much did I make in royalties this year compared to how much money did I make playing live? How much did I get in grant money compared to playing live? Merch sales, crowdfunding, licensing or sync deals, and then fees you charge as a musician. Let's say you're doing studio work for someone. That might be an income category that you want to track. But the CRA doesn't have different categories, so it's kind of up to you what buckets you want to put your income in. Mm-hmm.
I asked you before, but does reimbursements count as an income?
Yeah, it depends. It depends on how you want to track it. So either you could track it as an in and an out on the same area. So what would be a reimbursement that you've dealt with like in the past? What category would it be?
Like buying, like if I went and bought printing supply or like posters for an organization, and they would just reimburse me on the invoice along with my fees or whatever.
So in that case, because you did it on behalf of another organization, you didn't keep the things. I would say that both the income and the expense is counted as stationery and office supplies. One's a positive amount, one's a negative amount for that scenario.
So you put them both in expenses?
Yeah. But it would just offset. So in the end, you're netting zero, right?
Okay, so you wouldn't have like a separate, like I've been putting a separate income category for reimbursement.
You could. The thing is, at the end of the day, it all equals the same amount, right? So you're declaring that you made that in income, but then you're also counting it as an expense later. You're netting, you're still not paying tax on that amount, right?
Does it hurt my gross income though?
If you're worried about getting over a threshold for GST purposes, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Is that maybe where you're at? Yeah. I'd have to look at it with you and see. Yeah. The other reimbursement scenario that you might have is like, if you're traveling somewhere to play a performance and they pay for your flight and they might reimburse you for your hotel, do you count that all as your performance fees or do you offset your flight? So let's say, you're guaranteed $5,000 to play this show, but then they're also like, okay, then you send in your flight receipt after and they'll cover that. Honestly, it sort of depends. And again, it's just up to you to keep a record of it. And I would say write a note. Write really good notes for yourself. Why did you make this money? Who did you get the money from? What was the money for? And then you can decide with your tax professional where that's going, where that's getting categorized. Yeah. It gets a little more complicated when you're registered for sales tax, Ashley, just so you know, reimbursements. But yeah. Okay. I think we went over everything for this. Oh, income tax. Okay, question that lots of people have usually. I'm going to answer this question and then I'll answer your question after. Is grant money taxable? This is a main question that people ask. Yes, absolutely. 100% of the grant money is taxable, but there is a small exemption amount. And this is another example why your accounting information, your bookkeeping information is different than tax information. Because on income tax, they have an exemption. It's called the Artistic Projects Grant. Artistic project grants received separately or in addition to other scholarship income that is used in producing literary, dramatic, musical, or artistic works, you may claim the scholarship exemption amount of $500 to reduce the total amount that's included in your income. So if you get $1,000 from Canada Council of the Arts, you can tell the CRA on your income tax, I made $1,000, but I only have to pay income tax on $500 of that. Again, we don't have to worry about this. A tax professional will know about the exemption amount, and you just have to say, this is how much money I made on grants for the year. We want to make sure that we're, differentiating our income in that way. And there is a portion of your grant money that you're not going to pay tax on. But generally speaking, yes, grant money is all taxable income. And just because you don't get a T4A, again, you have to still report that amount. Mm-hmm.
And that's on all grants, not individual grants?
I can't remember. I think it's just a one-time amount. It's just 500 for the total that you made in grants. It's not for each individual. I'm pretty sure. It's been a long time since I've filed like an actual return, because even I'm like, I'm sending this to. I have a CPA that I send all my clients' stuff to. So, what was your question now?
I was just going to add, my accountant also told me that you can write off haircuts and clothing to a certain extent.
To a certain extent. I like that they have that.
Not every
yes.
haircut, but it was
yeah.
like, if you want to send me a couple
I think
for a year or something.
Do I have that on my list? Do I have it? Wardrobe and grooming. Usually that's what people call it, wardrobe and grooming expenses.
Right.
Do I have it on there though? Because I might have taken it off because my clients were abusing it. So, no, honestly, I was like, well, you can't just write off your whole wardrobe, But, for example, I have some musician clients that they're buying either traditional, like they are wearing this traditional outfit to perform in specifically, and it has like cultural significance. Absolutely, I would say that that's a business expense because you're wearing that like on stage. Or people that are opera singers, for example, they're usually wearing gowns. You're not wearing that to Superstore to go grocery shopping, So that would also be eligible. Haircuts, maybe you could make a case for it. You're like, I went on tour the next day. I needed a haircut, Again, like if you get audited, you might have to pay back the money if they don't think your answer is good enough. But that's why, again, keep really, really good notes. Yeah. I did take grooming expenses off there, didn't I? This is what I send to my clients, so yeah. Okay. That was income tax. Does anyone have any other questions?
So regarding PST, are you doing that?
I'm doing that next.
Okay.
You ready? Yeah. Sales tax. So we're going to talk about GST first. This is the one that most musicians will be interacting with first in their careers, and maybe only in their careers. A lot of musicians, we'll talk about this next, don't need to register for RST. So when are we registering? And when are we charging GST? And again, this is a separate entity than income tax. It's not the same thing. So the moment that you need to register for GST is when you make over $30,000 of business income, talking business still this whole time, self-employment business income, in gross income over 4 consecutive quarters. This is where the wording gets annoying and CRA-ish. So it's not just a calendar year. It's not January to December. It's any year at any time. It can move. So it's 4 consecutive quarters. Or obviously if you hit the 30K before that. So let's say I make $30,000 in the first 3 months that I'm a musician, you got to register then. So it's $30,000 within 4 consecutive quarters or before that. If you're getting near the $30,000 point, you're making almost $30,000, you should start thinking about talking to a tax professional, or not a tax professional, an accountant, or you can talk to me too. You can ask me questions about how to register and what that looks like. Again, that's $30,000 in gross income, so that's before expenses, and yes, grant income counts. So if you get a big Canada Council grant, you should look at what your income is. That's what a lot of people hit first. They might get a big Canada Council grant and then they are over the threshold and they don't realize. Mm-hmm. What happens if you don't register?
Yeah, because I got a bunch of money a couple of years ago, recorded an album, screwed up my taxes, just figured it out last month.
Mm-hmm.
But there was nothing about GST.
You could get audited, but if you don't, nothing happens. They could catch you or they could not. A lot of people can just fly under the radar for a little bit. So fingers crossed. You could register and back claim it, but you don't have to be extra compliant. Don't do that. Yeah. You can get GST audited. If the main reason why a GST audit happens is they see income reported on your income tax return, but yet you don't have a registration number. That's usually what flags them. And I have seen more GST audits for my clients than income tax audits. It's quite common to be audited for GST. This is a big secondary point. Only charge GST if you're registered. Do not charge GST to people if you do not have a GST number. There's so many online platforms that you just fill in the details and you're like, oh yeah, I'm in Canada, Stripe or Square or whatever, and they'll just turn on your tax for you. Don't collect, because that's not actually income that you're making. You're just holding the money for the government and giving it back to them. So if you're not remitting that money to the government, you're just collecting GST for no reason, and that's another thing that you can get audited on. So, did you have another question, Ashley?
Yes.
Okay.
Sorry.
No, that's okay.
The 30,000.
Yeah.
Because if you're a sole proprietor, it's connected to yourself. That's not related.
No, not your employed income. Not your employed income. Just your self-employment income. But for me, I started making more money with my Tonic business than I was with my music business. So I actually triggered GST for both because I was making. So that's actually a little bit annoying too because I'm a sole prop. Both of them. It's the total of both of them. So,
and then,
yeah.
Does the 30,000 count when you send an invoice for that much, or you assign an agreement or for that amount, or when it lands in your bank account is when it counts?
It depends on how you're tracking it, cash or accrual. I mean, that's getting into like nitty gritties. You'd have to look at it specifically and kind of decide. I would just say like, are you, like the thing is, registering before you hit the 30,000 is in your best interest because then you're not scrambling again. So if you're thinking you're approaching that, it might be good to just get your ducks in a row and register early. Yeah, you can also talk, so the way, actually I'll go to the next slide. Oh no, wait, I didn't write it on the next slide. Where you register is on the Canada Revenue Agency website on My Business account. So you're going to be able to do it online, and you can opt to register early, even if you don't hit the threshold. But if you're approaching $30,000, at that point in your career, you might already have team members. You might have a manager. You might have a bookkeeper. You might have some other people. Talk to your people. You can even talk to me. You can, talk to your tax professional. I would say try to register before you hit the threshold because it's a little more annoying to do back registration. So who's registered for GST? Okay.
I tried, but I don't think I was qualified to do so. I kind of got a little bit confused.
Yeah.
I might need to talk to you about
yeah.
that.
You might still be considered a small supplier. So small supplier means you're making under the 30,000 threshold. So you can opt into the program early, but there's no reason to.
Yeah,
so
that's what I thought.
Yeah.
Because I'm just like, well, I just started, right?
Yeah,
so,
you don't need to register yet.
It's kind of pointless, but then I just heard from other people, I'm like, you should really start signing up for this. I'm like, why?
Don't listen to them. Yeah.
I mean, yeah, like I'm putting on my first ever show on August 8th, and I'm like, I know I don't make.
No,
so
you're good.
When I decide to sell T-shirts, I don't have to charge GST.
No tax at all. Yeah, turn off all the tax. Do not put GST or PST on there.
However,
if you're not registered, do not collect tax. It should not be on invoices. It should not be on people's receipts, because hopefully, actually, I'll just go over what sales tax is too, because sometimes it's a little bit confusing. You're not paying out of pocket to the government or anything. You're adding an amount. You're adding 5% or 7% on to whatever you're charging. You're holding that money for the government, and then you're giving it to them. That's all you're doing. You're just being a middleman. So what's the point in turning the sales tax on if the government's like, we don't want this money, we don't need it yet? You should not have your RST or your GST turned on in any capacity or on your invoices unless you are registered and you're planning on collecting the money, holding it, and then giving it back to the CRA or Manitoba government if it's RST. You had one more question.
I have a partnership in a sole proprietor business. the sole proprietor is less than 30,000, the partnership is over 30,000. Am I supposed to be collecting
Yes,
GST
for the
on that?
partnership.
On the sole proprietor?
No.
Okay,
So different. Yeah, those ones are different. So you're good
that's
there.
great news.
Yeah.
'Cause I haven't been.
Okay, good. You're fine. So if you have GST, if you are registered for GST, so you get a GST number, you are making over $30,000 in 4 consecutive quarters or less amount of time, what you're going to charge GST on, and that's called taxable supply. There's a huge list on the CRA website. There's all these different criterias, and it's very confusing because to find industry-specific information is quite hard. But generally speaking, as musicians, we're charging GST on performance fees in Canada, selling merch in Canada, and other music services in Canada. Very specific, Canada, Canada-based, because tax has to do with place of supply, where you're performing or where you're supplying that to them. If you have specific questions, I would say, honestly, call the tax line on the CRA. It's their job to answer those types of questions for free. You can honestly get through pretty easily if you're calling through their business line and it's like tax specific, you can usually talk to a real person pretty fast. If you're like, this is a very specific situation, I don't know whether to charge or not, call the CRA and ask them. They have to answer the question. That's their job. Yeah. Can you think of, oh, okay. You're thinking of scenarios?
Like with virtually, like if people were like doing live stream performances on Twitch where they're getting paid by an American company, like how do you?
Good luck finding out those. I don't know what they are. Like there's so many confusing tax situations right now in Canada, just with online services in general, that even the CRA doesn't have clear. They're still trying to figure it out. So
that would include like YouTube, OnlyFans, Patreon, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I don't know. It's very complicated. If you're at the 30,000 threshold again, though, and you're registered, usually you have people on your team by that point. You have a bookkeeper, you have a tax preparer. You can ask them those questions too. So.
When you say taxable supply, you said something like taxable supply based on where?
Yeah. So
is that you or where you're supplying?
Where you're supplying to.
Okay.
Yeah. So not your base, but where you're supplying. So it's place of supply. So it shows in Canada, selling merch in Canada to people in Canada, and other music services in Canada. So if you're giving workshops, if you're doing production, and big note, music lessons in Canada, well, everywhere, music lessons are exempt from tax. So if you're teaching music lessons, you actually don't have to charge GST. It falls under education. So the government has made that an exempt service. Another one, actually I should add another asterisk too. Sometimes there might be scenarios where the person you're supplying something to says, I'm GST exempt. So a big example would be if you perform on a reserve, because often First Nations organizations are GST exempt. They do not have to pay GST. So if you're providing a taxable supply, a taxable service on reserve, you don't have to charge GST or HST, but they have to provide their exemption number to you. Has anyone had a scenario where someone said, well, I don't pay GST? No? Okay. Yeah? Was it specific to like the location or?
No, it's just because they didn't know what they were doing.
Yes, that happens as well.
All the time.
All you can do is say, well, do you have an exemption number? And if they don't know what that means, that probably means they don't know what they're talking about. So generally speaking, like when in doubt, charge the GST and collect it and remit it. That would keep you safe. Yeah. What time is it? How fast are we going?
8:06.
8:06. We're doing this till, oh gosh, okay. We're gonna power through the rest. So really quick, GST recoverables. So you're collecting all this money, you're collecting GST on behalf of the government, 5% on top of what you charge. You can recover a little bit back from that, and it's called input tax credits. You'll hear accounting people say ITCs. Input tax credits reduce your total GST due back to the government. It's the GST you paid for your business expenses. So you can claim your ITCs for taxable or zero rated goods and services not exempt. The only example that I come across for musicians for this is if you're doing music lessons. So if you're doing music lessons, you teach guitar, and you are charging you're over the 30 threshold, you're registered for GST, you're charging GST for your performances, right? You're not charging GST for your music lessons, but you do have expenses for both of those activities that had GST. You're buying guitar strings for your performances, and you're also paying, you're buying music lesson books then to use in your music teaching part of your business. You can use the GST paid for your strings as an input tax credit, but you can't use the GST paid for those music lesson books. It's such a weird little detail. Honestly, again, I wouldn't worry about it too much, because if you're registered for GST, you usually have help with filing. This is just another reason why we should be just taking really, really good notes and keeping really, really good records. Because if you do get GST audited and they say, oh, well, some of your ITCs were ineligible, that might be why. So generally speaking, though, that's why it's important to keep all your receipts for your bookkeeping, because there's two different places where you know, write off your expenses, but if you're GST registered, you can also write off it's kind of a write-off. You can subtract the GST you paid against the GST you owe the government, and you remit less to them. Does that make sense? Okay. RST, or PST, retail sales tax. So this is Manitoba specific. It's the same threshold. They just changed this. It used to be $10,000, and they changed it last year. And I didn't know that, so I've just discovered this. The threshold is $30,000 in annual taxable sales. And this is taxable sales for RST purposes. So it's not your total gross income. It's the taxable income as specific to like RST. So it's your Manitoba sales. And we'll talk about what items are taxable supply for RST in the next slide. Again, only charge PST if you're registered. Turn it off on the Square and on Squarespace and all that stuff. The way that you register for RST is different. You have to go through the entity called Taxes. It's part of the Manitoba government. And you file either annually, quarterly, or monthly. Same with GST. The things that really the only thing that musicians will have to deal with for RST is selling merch, clothing items. So you essentially have to be making $30,000 in merch sales in order to register. I don't know anyone that's registered for RST.
So this is calculated separately from performance sales. So you have to be selling $30,000 of merch.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
essentially.
Okay.
For taxable supply. So there might be some other items that you might deal with, but the main one is merch, and it's less common to get audited for RST. So like if you're making over 30K, you're usually talking to someone, and they will advise you if you should be registered for PST. But most musicians I know, because you're doing so many other sales outside of Manitoba as well, you're not, and that's $30,000 of Manitoba sales. Place of supply matters here again, right? So most musicians, and albums, so like physical goods, right? So that's like vinyl, CDs, clothing. You have to be making over $30,000 of Manitoba-based sales. People in Manitoba buying your stuff. The best practice, again, is to turn off automatic tax on all of your things unless you're registered. Do not collect tax if you're not registered. For RST, we'll briefly go over this because RST probably won't be relevant for most of us. There are recoverables, quote unquote, for RST. They do give you a little bit of money back as a commission fee just for doing it for them. Woohoo, thank you, government. It's very small. The only time RST is recoverable is, so RST you can't get back like input tax credits, so whatever PST you've paid on expenses, you just pay it. You're not getting it back on the amount that you owe. The only time is if you accidentally paid RST and you should have been exempt. it's again very specific. If you, for whatever reason, are registered, if you're making a ton of money in merch sales in Manitoba and you're registered for RST, and you buy T-shirts, unprinted T-shirts in bulk, for example, you technically should be giving them your RST number and not paying the RST on those T-shirts, but charging the RST on the end person purchasing them. If, for whatever reason, the T-shirt supplier charges you RST, you could get that money back. RST is supposed to be at the last point of sale. So you'll see people in other industries often, like manufacturing, let's say you're a woodworker or something, if you're buying wood and supplies and then at the end you have a furniture product, you give your RST exempt number to all of the people that you buy your supplies from at the beginning, and then you charge RST at the end. This really doesn't apply to most musicians, retail sales tax, so we don't have to worry about it. If you're making over $10,000 in another province, for whatever reason, on your physical goods, I would say talk to a bookkeeper or an accountant and ask them, should I be registering for any of these provincial sales tax entities? Because all the provinces have different thresholds. Saskatchewan, I think, is like, if you make any money in Saskatchewan, you're supposed to register technically. Yeah, no one's registering. That's like, nah, don't bother. Agreed. I think BC's 10 grand, like it's all different. If you're making over $10,000 in merch consistently in another province, talk to someone, I would say. That's sales tax. Any questions about sales tax? Okay. The last bit that we're going to talk about is bookkeeping best practices. Everyone's still with me? Woohoo! Rachel's supposed to roll out eventually and give me some facial expressions. There you go. I need some water. Okay, so we know what entities are going to be looking for this information, but what records are we keeping and how are we keeping them and what information are we keeping? So I keep talking about how this is our job. We're not tax preparers, we're not accountants, we are record keepers. We're taking really good notes. Generally speaking, you really only need these 4 to 5 points, and this information has to be accessible if you get audited. And really, this is why receipts look the way they do, if you think about it. So your records for your income should have the date, the vendor, which is the fancy name for the person you were talking with or the entity you dealt with, the details, so whatever details will help you explain where the income came from, the amount, this is important, and then GST collected if you're registered. So I like to see GST broken out if you're registered, if that's applicable for you. For your expenses, the exact same information needs to be on there. What was the date, what was the vendor, what were the details, what was the amount, and the GST you paid if you're registered should be separated.
Question about the amount before GST. If I paid PST on something, but I include a PST in the amount paid, or is it the subtotal before?
It's up to you. Like, what I would do, normally, it depends on what your record keeping system ends up being. Whatever's clearest. Like, you need to be able to access the information and make decisions on it and explain things. So if you have to see the total as it matches the receipt, like, okay, if you spent, you spent like $21.50 or something, and $1.50 of that was taxed, but the $20 was, that's not correct math, but whatever. I would still put the total line, but then have a GST line beside it. Some people like to have the pre-tax amount, then the GST amount. It depends on what system you're doing to keep these records, and we'll talk about different systems in the next slide too. But regardless of if you're putting this in a spreadsheet, if you're writing this down on a piece of paper, if you're using tax software or bookkeeping software, no matter where you're putting this information, these pieces have to be there. And this is what shows up on receipts. And also, reminder, why it's important to get itemized receipts. You'll sometimes hear bookkeepers talk about itemized receipts. An itemized receipt lists details. So when you pay for something with your debit card, you know how you usually get one printout from their machine? That little debit slip doesn't have the details of the item that you purchased. It just has the date, it has the total, it doesn't have the tax breakdown. The receipt you get from the till is the itemized receipt. So if I go to a coffee shop and I ask for the receipt, usually the barista just prints off the debit machine receipt. You have to ask the person, can I have the itemized receipt? And then they'll pull it out of the till. So if you can get both, it's annoying, but it's the best, that's the best practice, to keep itemized receipts and credit card or debit slips. Now, a lot of tills, all the information is actually on the itemized, so it's kind of nice because now I just keep that one. So it should have, and then it also has the tip sometimes, so like the tip breakdown. So it should have the total, it should have the date. This is also a good reminder of what your invoices should have on them. So if you're invoicing, which sometimes you do have to do as musicians, you're not invoicing the venues that you're playing at, for example, but let's say you're doing gig work and you're a studio musician, so you get hired. So I play saxophone and I've done studio work for other bands. So I'm going to invoice the band at the end of the session. My invoice should have the date, my name and their name, the vendor, the details of what I did, the amount, and if I'm GST registered, it has to have the GST breakdown on it. There are so many musician invoices that I see that have only one of these, only 3 of them. Like, it needs to have just this basic information. Your invoices do not have to look pretty. They just have to have this information on them. And it needs to have your name. I should actually include that on there. A lot of musicians will forget to put their own name on their invoices.
Who the check is payable to.
Who the check is payable to, yes. Check payable to. It doesn't need to be, like, if you're a sole prop, I would say you need to have your first and last name as well as your operating name, because often you have a bank account that still has your name attached to it. So it's important to have this information on your invoices if you're sending them. Yeah.
So an expense, is this where, when I'm paying out my band after a show and I don't get them to invoice me?
Yeah, that happens often.
So
yeah.
Is that wrong?
That's okay. In our industry, there's not going to be a lot of invoicing happening, but you need to have an expense record that somewhere lists the date that it happened, who you paid, the details, the amount, and the GST. They don't necessarily have to send you an invoice, but you need to have that information written down somewhere. And we'll talk about the different ways, the different systems. So in a spreadsheet, you'll also have your e-transfer confirmation in your email that you could save as a receipt. Some people like to flag those emails in their inbox. Yeah,
so like
that's
I
fine.
would just like search all my Interac and just make a spreadsheet.
Make a
from
spreadsheet.
those.
Yeah.
Okay.
My way of tracking I love spreadsheets. I'm just gonna say that. I'm like spreadsheet obsessed. So nerdy.
Excel, let's go.
I love Excel. Oh, but like honestly, I've been using the same. We'll look at my spreadsheet next. I've been using the same Excel spreadsheet for my entire music business. I don't use bookkeeping software for my music stuff because it's just so easy to have everything in the lines there. You can write it in a note. You can write it in a notebook. You can have bookkeeping software. You just have to have this information accessible and legible and easy to pull up. That's the main point.
I was just thinking, in, like, Chuck, like if you have like a bunch of gigs, instead of making them invoice for each one, or like if they want to invoice it, could you make them like a little like work log, or like this day was the show, this is where it happened, this is where you paid it, and then they just sign at the end once, and then.
Yeah, and you don't even like I for my performance income, I don't even get, because well my one band that's my bigger band, I don't actually do any of the bookkeeping for them, so I just track my own stuff as my expenses. So they do have records from venues that we play, but when I do solo gigs or when I do gigs with my smaller band, we're never invoicing the venue. We just have a spreadsheet and we say, well, we played the Daughter, we played the Park Theater, we played wherever, that's how much money we made. We're never getting confirmation from the venue owners. So, yeah. If you play bigger, like if you're playing a Live Nation show, they'll have slips. If you ever play shows that like, they're giving you a merch person, you'll get slips. There will be points in your career that you will already be at a spot where other entities are, giving you this information. It'll make more sense when you're there. For right now, too, like, just make sure you have that in your own record somewhere accessible. Actually, no, I want to show you my spreadsheet. Okay. This is very small, but I can send you all a copy of this too. I lifted this off Heather Bishop. So props to Heather Bishop. I took a course, it still exists, it's a really good program. It's called The Art of Managing Your Career at Creative Manitoba. It's for all music disciplines. Have you done it as well?
No,
it's so good, hey?
We present it with them.
I do the finance module. So if you take it, you'll get me again. Heather made a version of this and I've adopted it and kind of made things differently. But this is how I've tracked my music business for like 15 years. I just use a spreadsheet. So I have the date in the first column. I like to have a little note if I have a physical receipt or not, the vendor name, details, and then I track all of my income in one line, and I just break it out after because like usually in this item line, I write like grant, or performance fees. I just found it easier to just track all of my income in one column. You could make different columns. Again, like this is completely customizable to what you are doing. This is just an example of what I found was easiest because I do this is also a giant spreadsheet. Then I have my expense categories all across, and this is all based off of the tax form that we looked at and my expense categories there. So you'll see that, okay, I went to Long and McQuaid on January 15th. I should probably have the year on here. Actually, no, I have the year in the tab. So this is all 2022. See, there we go, I'm organized. I bought strings. So I'm gonna put that in the music supplies line as a negative amount. So I spent $15. And at the bottom, I have a sum, I have an auto sum. This is an extremely simplified Excel spreadsheet. The only formula that is happening is a sum here, and then I have a net sum formula at the bottom too. It's a little cumbersome because it's so long, but it's just, I found this is the easiest way to do it. And then my income, so I went to the Goodwill, RIP Goodwill. Public domain, I'll change that to public domain. So I played the public domain. I put who I played with, just so I could remember, and the date, how much money I made, and that's summing at the bottom. And you can see I have my net income, my net bookkeeping income, not my tax income, my net bookkeeping income here. So right now I've made $235. This is one example of how you can keep the information. It honestly doesn't matter. It needs to be something that you will visit, something that you will do consistently, and something that makes sense to you. If you hate spreadsheets, don't use this. Like, keep all of your receipts and write it in a Word document. Like, it just has to be accessible, and you have to be able to give it to a tax professional at the end of the year, or somehow be able to add these categories together to get your final numbers. Does anyone use a spreadsheet already? Yay.
I mean, I will be.
You will be? Okay. Does anyone have tax or accounting software? Use QuickBooks? No? What do you use?
Wave.
Okay, Wave is free and it has good invoicing. So that's like a lot of people use Wave first. So
Yeah.
I like Wave.
I use Wave as well.
Okay. Awesome.
Wave.app.
Wave is nice too because if you pay for it, they have like a receipt upload function now. So you can use, QuickBooks also has a receipt upload function, which is really nice. That's
The
why I use it.
Wave's receipt capture doesn't work as well as QuickBooks.
Really?
It works okay. It's
Okay.
a little confusing though.
Yeah, and you have to pay for it, I
You do.
believe. Yeah.
And then you can also just email your invoices directly inside the software as well if you pay for it.
Yes, that's what QuickBooks does. You can email your receipts to QuickBooks and it'll get uploaded to your QuickBooks account automatically, which is really nice.
Or I mean with invoices and waves.
Oh, you're in, yeah.
So
Oh,
you
your
can
invoices.
email your invoices as well to
Oh,
people
okay. Yeah.
in the software.
Yeah, you can send them straight from Wave.
Yeah.
Yes,
I
that's
think
also
it
really
accepts
good.
credit cards and ACH and stuff. via
Yeah.
that as well. I'm assuming QuickBooks is the same.
QuickBooks is the same, yeah. Yeah, Wave is really common for gig workers and like contract workers too, but QuickBooks I would say is the general standard for like all small businesses, so that's why I use QuickBooks with all my clients, because I work across different industries. So, do you need bookkeeping software? No. You don't. You can use a spreadsheet for as long as it works for you. You can use whatever, the main point, like I can't tell you what bookkeeping system you should use. It just needs to be something that you access often, that you are revisiting, and that you know how to navigate. If this is like, oh my gosh, this is overwhelming, I hate this, don't use this. Think of a different way to do this, you know? So this is an example of what I've used for years.
So you're gonna send that
Do you guys want this?
XLS?
Yeah, I can send this.
Because I can just look that up for the Google and just
Yeah, so it's a Google Sheets file. So I'll share it and it'll be locked, and then you just have to save a copy, and
go to Canada.
and then you can edit it as you please. But I also have like little resources that you can check out on the next tab. So this is one of the things that I send to my clients and people that I do consults with. So yeah, so that's a good example of a bookkeeping system that is easy, it's straightforward. You just need to be able to access it all the time. So when we're talking about record keeping, last points, like why are we keeping this info? Obviously, that's a summary. I want to summarize. We're keeping this info because we're writing off our expenses on our taxes. That's the first thing that we looked at. We're also keeping this info because maybe we need to estimate how much money you might owe in income tax or in sales tax for the year. If you're only doing your bookkeeping at year end, and then you're getting this huge tax bill, that's not good information. That's not helping you plan your lifestyle as a musician, as a working, self-employed person. You should be doing your bookkeeping during the year so you have an estimate on, at the end, what am I claiming? What am I declaring? It's really hard to estimate. Like if you ask me, well, I made X amount of dollars in music, how much tax do I owe? I would not be able to answer that question because I don't know your personal income tax information. I don't know what deductions or credits you're eligible for. It's kind of a more complex question, but generally speaking, what I tell people is if you take your net income from your self-employed information and you times that by 20%, that's a good base level of like, maybe I should think about putting aside some of that money for income tax, okay? So that's another reason why we're doing bookkeeping and why we're keeping our records throughout the year. The third point is to keep up with grants and management. So if you have artists, does anyone have artist management? Does anyone have a manager that's taking a cut? So normally the manager fee would be about 10% to 15% of your income. That's what generally managers charge in Canada. So that means all of the income that you make as a musician, they're taking 10 to 15% of that. They need to know what you're making as income. So most management deals will require you to have bookkeeping. That's why a lot of people hire me, because they all of a sudden are like, I have a deal, I have a management deal now, and they're asking me for my financials and I don't have any information. That's another reason why we're keeping our records. And the last point of why we're keeping this information is just to have better information about your personal budget, about your band's budget, and to make the information accessible to whoever needs the information. So that might be other band members, that might be your management team, that might be grant agencies, that might be your spouse or your partner. Like, you need to know how your business is doing to make decisions in your life. Do this. Can I just be self-employed? Can I only have my music business as what's supporting me? If you don't have records for the whole time, how can you make decisions like that? I mean, some people do make decisions and then deal with it later. But I had to decide to quit my day job and start my bookkeeping business. And I had the financial information that I needed in order to make that decision, because I was already starting to take on clients. I had an estimate of how much money I could be making doing bookkeeping, for example. And I knew how much money I was making as a musician as well. Music can't sustain me full time. I play in a genre that I play heavy metal music. No one's making a lot of money in that unless you're a huge band. So I knew I needed a day job. So I would say that like the fourth point is actually one of the most important points of why we're keeping bookkeeping information. Yes, you have to file your income tax and talk to grant agencies and report, but really this is for your own personal benefit to have this information, because you can make better decisions. So the things that we're turning into our habits are we're keeping our receipts and we're keeping track of our expenses, we're tracking our income, and we're keeping everything in one place. So that's, again, keep it accessible, make it a system that you're going to revisit over and over and over again, and turn it into a habit. It should not be a one-time at the end of the tax year. It can be, that's okay if it is right now. That's what most people do. But I would say it's in your best interest, for the reasons that we just talked about, to do this all year round. And it's really only these 3 points that you need to turn into habits. Keep track of your expenses, keep track of your income, and put it all in an accessible place. Yeah? I think I have one more slide left. No? 2 more slides. What time is it? We're getting close.
8:32.
One quick question. With your the spreadsheet and doing it not in a bookkeeping system, do you just keep all of your receipts in a Google Drive folder?
Yeah, I take pictures from my phone and then keep it in a Google Drive. I also have a receipt scanner. I bought one like years and years and years ago. It's this crappy little receipt scanner, and I also scan all of my receipts and save them. I just have like a folder on my desktop. There's apps you can use. You can also keep all your physical receipts in an envelope and have them year to year. You can have them in like a accordion folder if you want. The problem with that is they fade. So I would take a picture. Now, I know on iPhone, if you take a photo to Google Drive, you can actually the photo can turn into a PDF or a document. It gives you that option, which is really nice. So I use my phone.
And do you keep your Google folder, your Drive folder, pretty organized? You have it organized with folders with each
the expense category? No.
You just kind of
I
lump it all in there?
throw them all in there. And I don't even rename them. I just put it by year. I do that with all my other clients. I'm not doing that for myself. So yeah, because the main thing is if I get audited, I know where everything is. I have super good notes. I know how to find it. Whatever is going to make that possible for you, do that. Yeah.
Cheat code, if you want to use a spreadsheet, make a Google form.
Okay.
Oh!
You can upload your receipts to
That's
the Google
smart.
form, and then they are linked in line in the spreadsheet.
Well, that's good. I like that. I should look at
If
your
you want to
Google
talk
form.
about doing that, we can do that.
It's fun. I like that. Yeah, it's like whatever you're going to revisit, whatever you're going to keep turning, if that's an easy habit for you to form, just filling out that form every time, then absolutely do that. So we talked about we have to track our expenses, track our income, and keep it all in one place. These are just some points of how we're doing it and when we're doing it and how to make these into habits for yourself. So one really easy one that I use for all of my clients is use a separate business credit card or a debit card. I would say credit card. If you're okay with putting things on credit and you know that you're going to pay it off, I would highly recommend just using a business credit card for every single thing for your music business and then paying that balance off right away. It's a really nice way of doing your bookkeeping. You can look at your credit card statement and be like, everything that's on this card is a business expense. Did I miss anything? Am I missing any receipts? Where are we keeping our receipts? You can keep them in a physical folder, you can keep them in cloud storage, you can flag it in your email, you just have to have it somewhere. And I would say, yeah, electronic receipts are a lot easier to keep because they don't degrade. For your income, we're writing it down somewhere. We can use a spreadsheet. You can use a central storage system like Google Drive or Dropbox. You can have a shared note. You can keep a notebook in your merch box to keep track of that. Physical folders, at my last point, get a big old spreadsheet like I'm gonna give you. This is the how. It's really customized to whatever you're going to keep coming back to. When are we doing it? I find that a lot of musicians, if they don't have it scheduled, they're not going to visit it. A lot of the time, tax season is when you do it. I would say put a time in your calendar or your schedule more often than once a year. Pair it with another habit that you do. Whenever maybe you answer certain other work emails on Fridays, you could also just quickly look at your music bookkeeping. I don't do music bookkeeping every week. I do it maybe every 3 months for my music business. Essentially, you should be basing how often you're doing it on the volume of your music transactions. If you're
gigging really, really heavily, you might need to be looking at your bookkeeping information more often. If you are gigging 3 times a year, maybe you do it twice a year. You can do your bookkeeping information when you get your credit card statements, for example. And this is my other note. Just do it before tax season is over. I think a lot of musicians are doing it after the fact. Starting now, we hopefully will do it before tax season.
When's it over?
So the filing deadline for sole proprietors and partnerships is June 15th, but if you owe, the money that you owe is due before that. It's in April. So, but the filing is due June 15th. So. This is another, oh yeah, I forgot I threw this one in here. This is an example of a band spreadsheet. If anyone wants to see this, I can send this to you, just because sometimes you want to track the system outside of your personal one. Maybe a bunch of people are all paying into sort of a band account. In this scenario, this is what I use for my band. Everyone's actually like a sole prop, but we do have a spreadsheet that tracks the band activity over time. But at the end, we're all getting our net amounts at the end of the year. So this is a nice little band spreadsheet that I made. So I'm not going to go over this one, but just know that like, if you have a scenario that like your spreadsheet isn't fulfilling for you, think about like, okay, well, what information do we need? How do we need it organized? How is it accessible to everyone? You just create that system, you know? Yeah, this is what I use for my band. Well, I'm not in the Beatles, but I renamed everyone. So yeah, like if John paid $200 out of his pocket for t-shirts, that's a negative. The band owes John $200. George collected the $300, and then they paid him back. Oopsies. And then I also tracked what was in and out of the band bank account at the time. So this is sort of like ongoing example of how a band would track things. But again, all of these individuals are sole proprietors, and they have their totals for the year end for their taxes too. So, okay, I'm done, finally. Good job, everyone. 3 takeaways. You should be maintaining access to your CRA or your tax accounts. All of this doesn't matter if you cannot get into your CRA account and file your taxes at the end of the year. A lot of people get locked out. It's a huge, annoying process. So if you want to, if you take away one thing from today, go home and see if you can access your My Business account from a CRA if you have a business number. Figure out what your bookkeeping system is and where to find things. So whatever that looks like, the big spreadsheet, the Google Drive, the Dropbox, the folder that's semi-organized, whatever it is, you know what it is and you know where to find things. And the other takeaway is that we're using this information that we have to make decisions. We're not doing this for another entity, really, we're doing this for ourselves. Like, this is in your best interest. You can figure out what amount of tax you owe. Is tour possible? You know, how much money does the band make? Do you need a grant for the next project that you're doing, or can you fund it on your own? Can you pay your band members out, or should you be retaining the money in your band? These are questions that people will be asking all the time in your music career, and if you don't have bookkeeping information, you can't be making these decisions properly. So those are our reminders, our takeaways. Don't forget to register for sales tax before and not after. You can always ask questions if you have specific things, and you should all file your taxes. The end. Thank you. I didn't even read my notes. So, there we go. We went over time, I guess, but who's got burning questions for me?
I have 2 quick questions.
Okay.
You mentioned the Creative Manitoba Financial thing.
Okay, yeah, so
there...
it's called The Art of Managing Your Career, and it's how many months? Ashley was a coordinator for it.
I think they've split it up now, so that it used to be 6 months and now it's 3 and 3, is that correct?
3 and 3, do you know what they changed AMYC to?
Is it 3 months now each?
Is AMYC 3?
So it used to be the 6.
Yeah, they made some adjustments.
Yeah, I think it's shorter. I think so. You go in the evenings.
Yeah.
It's really good. You go in the evenings and you have all these different areas of your business, and it's all disciplines. So like you might have visual artists, you might have dancers, you might have photographers, musicians, whatever in your class, and you go over all these different areas of what it means to be a self-employed artist. It's great. So I do the finance module for that one. Yeah.
We also have a creative entrepreneurship day coming up in March that will have another taxes portion as well.
Okay.
You do a great job. But if you have more questions, someone will be there as well.
Cool, thanks.
I think you guys, yeah, usually they get like someone from an actual tax firm to do that one, which is helpful. But, yeah.
And then,
Yeah,
sorry.
one more question.
If you're buying used music gear,
Yeah.
is there something that I can get to like
I mean,
include that? You know what I mean?
just
So
write it
I-
in your spreadsheet.
Yeah,
Like,
you know what I
do
mean?
get that information. Like I said, like you want to know the vendor name. Like write down the person's name that you bought it from. Write the total amount. Write the date. You don't need to get them to write up a invoice
Yeah.
or a receipt for you.
Okay.
Like our
an e-transfer.
yeah. If you get audited, you could find the e-transfer.
Even if it's like kind of an expensive thing, it's okay. You just kind of okay.
Yeah, our industry is like very cash based and very non-receipt based.
Okay.
If it's expensive, maybe don't pay for it in cash. Like
Yeah.
they could, if you get audited, the CRA could be like, this is not enough information. We're not letting you write that off as an expense. I haven't really seen that happen to anyone. Just keep good records of it, like in a different place. So if you don't, you're gonna come across lots of scenarios where you're not getting income, invoices, and you're not getting receipts. Whatever you can do to track it the best way is A-okay.
Cool.
Yeah. For my clients, because I'm using bookkeeping software and they have a lot of grant requirements, I would say, most grant agencies want proof of purchase. You'll hear that word. And so I save e-transfer confirmations as the receipt.
Cool.
Yeah. And it's nice because e-transfer confirmations, in the notes part, you can write what it was for. So use that, to your advantage. Write a little note to yourself so you remember, used guitar, whatever, from this person, and write that in the e-transfer when you send it. That's a nice way of remembering.
Cool.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome.
Yeah.
On one of your almost last slides,
I
you
rushed to
mentioned.
the end.
I appreciate everything you said. On one of the last slides, you mentioned the CRA file and the business number together.
Oh, yes.
And if you're a sole proprietor,
So,
it's all on your personal. CRA
you
number,
have a
right? Or do
separate
you have-
login.
Oh,
Yeah.
separate login for.
So you have a separate login. It's called My Business Account for the CRA, and they'll give you a different area. So you have your the thing is though, it's like it depends how you log into the CRA as well, which is so confusing. So there's different ways to log in. You can have like a login username and then a password, or there's ways to like log in through your bank, which I don't know how to do. But essentially, once you're in, there's another area. There's a separate area. So that area is called like My Business Account, and having access to that is extremely important. I would say personally, you should have access to your CRA because that's where all your T4 slips go. That's where our carbon tax information goes, our GST rebates, stuff like that. So,
Okay, but as a sole proprietor, it is all filed under personal,
yeah,
but it's a separate area, so there's additional. Okay, thank you.
yeah. Like
Yeah.
you'll be able to see once you're on there.
Yeah,
Like
that
it
makes sense.
kind of walks you through, but
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay, so I have a business number.
Yeah.
That's what confused me too. So I just filed my taxes last year, but it had some, that was the first year I had to do the business.
Yeah, the business portion.
All the grant stuff and whatever, it messed up all the taxes. So 2023, but I don't have a little business. I thought that was only if you do GST like that. So I've never looked at the business part of the CRA. I just deal with
Yeah.
my personal.
You'll still be able to see business stuff on the side, even if you're not GST. Log in again. You might not have any reason to access it. Just poke around, and if you have questions, shoot me an email. But make sure you have access to it. That's the main point. Like, you might not be needing to interact with it. Your tax preparer might. So, yeah. The main thing that I see is just people are locked out of it, and it takes so long to get back in. So just make sure you're in beforehand. Keep access to that. Write your password down. Put it on a sticky note. Like, whatever. Yeah.
For the CRA, from the CRA.
Yeah.
They have a way that they'll give you to print out like a printout boxes with different codes in it, and then it's like, this time put in 1A, and then you go and find that and nothing put in.
Oh gosh, yeah,
But, I don't know.
they sometimes have to mail you your username and stuff, like it's complicated. So thank you all for listening, fill out your surveys, thank you for coming. Is there any